Welcome back to Changemaker Q&A, everybody. Today's episode is going to be a really useful one for anybody who is either active in the activism or campaigning space, or perhaps even community organizing space, as well as anybody who is just interested in understanding how they could use meaningful conversations as a tool to drive change. So the inspiration for this episode comes from a question that I was asked, and I'm going to read the question aloud. Do you think a person who is delicate can be a good communicator without having social media? Do you think they could still make a decent impact? This is a great question, and there's a lot of directions I think I could take my answer, but I wanted to frame it in a way that not only highlights the value of having conversations for change, but also in a way that provides you with a very practical tool or framework that, like I mentioned, is going to be really useful for anybody who is an activist or a community organizer. Now, conversations for change, I think, are one of the most overlooked tools that we have to drive social change. I think that they're great because anybody can engage in conversations for change. We all have conversations with the people in our lives, whether it's family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, people we meet out and about, whatever it might be. And the thing with conversations for change is I think that so often we feel like we need to engage in a conversation where we are changing somebody's opinion. But opinions don't really work like that. We could think of our opinions as like an iceberg, where our opinions sit at the top of the iceberg. Just below the surface of the water, we have our kind of general beliefs or attitudes towards certain topics and things. And then at the bottom of the iceberg is where our values lie. Now, the thing about our values is they're very hard to change. Typically, we don't really change our values throughout our lives. And so the key to changing people's opinions is to actually change their attitudes towards something in a way that still aligns with their underlying values. Conversations for change should be thought of as things that we all engage in and we can all engage in. And rather than thinking about them as aiming to just change somebody's opinion or get them to think about something differently. And so conversation that we have with somebody is like planting a little seed. And then that person is going to go off, and once that seed has been planted, they're going to engage with other people. They're going to engage with the media. They're going to see stories. They're going to hear things. And those things that people are consuming might like water those little seeds that you've planted. And eventually, if we plant enough seeds and people can nourish these seeds enough, it will eventually get them to think about something differently. This was an analogy that was often used in the animal rights space when I used to engage in a lot of animal welfare and animal rights activism. There was this analogy that we would use, and it was like a point system. And because we're all raised with such different cultural views and attitudes towards animals and the treatment of animals, it was assumed that like every individual we engage with has a different number that they need to reach to get to the point at which they will begin to change or shift their attitudes towards animals. As you can imagine, somebody who has maybe been raised with a particular religious upbringing is going to think very differently about the treatment of animals, sentience, what is right and wrong when it comes to the treatment of animals, compared to maybe somebody who grew up on a cattle station or somebody who grew up with a different religious upbringing. And so if every person has their own number, we used to use the analogy that like every conversation we had with people, every time they saw a news story or an article about the treatment or mistreatment of animals, that was going to give them like 1 point. And you didn't know how many points each person needs to accrue, but we would just think of it as giving them their next point. And so we could think of that same analogy when it comes to getting people to think differently about a particular issue or a cause. And the way that we can think about it, or the tool that we can use to think about it, is this framework called the spectrum of allies. Essentially, it's like a semicircle spectrum, and it's broken up into 5 different sections. So on the right-hand side is people who are actively opposed to our cause. The next little section is people who are passively opposed. In the middle, it is neutral, so people who are not for or against our cause. They simply don't really have an opinion of it. And then on the left, there are people who are passive allies. And then furthest left are people who are active allies. So we could think of active allies as people who are actively engaged in work across the social change space to promote that particular cause. Passive allies are people who are maybe supporters or people who agree with us, but maybe they are not as active in addressing, but perhaps the reason they are not actively engaged in our cause is because they are actively engaged in another cause. And we have to recognize that everybody cannot be an active ally for every single cause. We just don't have the capacity to be actively engaged in every single issue and every single cause we care about. So the thing about the spectrum of allies is our goal should be to just move people from whatever side they're on as close as we can get them to being active allies. And I think that if people are passive allies, that should be enough, assuming that these people are active allies for other causes. We could probably do an entire other episode on this topic, but it is unreasonable to assume that every single person who cares about an issue has the capacity to be an active ally for that cause. A passive ally might be somebody who maybe attends the occasional protest or event for a particular cause, but they're not going to be active organizers. They're not going to be active spokespeople for that particular cause because they're probably dedicating the majority of their time to other causes. And so the goal with the spectrum of allies, I think, should be to have those conversations with people, get them as close as we can to active allies. But if somebody is a passive ally, recognizing that is okay. And all we can do is keep giving them these metaphorical points. To understand the spectrum of allies a little bit deeper, the model essentially divides our constituency, so the people that we might be dealing with in our work, into these 5 categories. So active allies are those who fully support the movement and are actively involved. Passive allies are those who agree with our movement, but they are not as actively engaged. People who are neutral are people who are uninformed, undecided, or disengaged from the issue. I think a lot of the time we can confuse people who are uninformed and undecided about an issue for people who are opposed. There is a kind of sentiment that says people who stay silent on issues of injustice have chosen the side of the oppressor. I think that is only true when those people have been actively engaged in education about that particular issue, and when those people are not preoccupied with other issues or simply dealing with their own survival. I think that we forget that for a lot of issues, there is a large degree of privilege involved with having the capacity to educate yourself about a particular topic, to spend time engaging with experts and listen to lectures and engage with mainstream media, particularly platforms that maybe have a paywall behind them. So many people are disengaged from these issues simply because they don't have the capacity for it. We're living in an era where the cost of living is skyrocketing, mental health crises are at an all-time high. People simply don't have the mental or physical capacity to engage in these issues. And I don't think it's because they don't care. I think it's just because the world is already a lot for a lot of people. So people who are neutral aren't necessarily opposed to our cause. Then we get people who are passively opposed. I think this is where the majority of people who are opposed to us would probably sit. So these are people who maybe disagree with our cause or our movement, but they're not actively resisting it. People who are actively opposed are those who are strongly opposed and they're actively working against the movement. I think that it can feel like a lot of the opposition is actively opposed, but I think that's just because they are the loudest people that we see. They are the people that are on social media posting divisive content, posting misinformation, posting hateful, fearful comments and content about our issues and causes that we care about. I think the majority of people who are opposed are those who might be engaging with that content, but they're not actively creating it. And so we can feel like there are a lot of people who are actively opposed when they are just the vocal minority. I want to give an example of what this framework can look like in action. So using the civil rights movement as an example, we could think of the spectrum of allies in terms of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, recognised that there were a lot of white northern students that were quite sympathetic to their cause, but they lacked a clear entry point for participation. And these students didn't really need to be convinced of the moral legitimacy of the civil rights movement, but they needed a really clear invitation to join the struggle. So when they organised the Freedom Summer program in 1964, the SNCC moved a lot of sympathetic students from being passive allies to being active allies because it gave them direct involvement in voter registration efforts in the South. So these students, in turn, would then influence a lot of their families and social networks, perhaps moving them from being passive opponents to being passive allies. They were able to shift a lot of neutral or indifferent white communities in particular to becoming passive allies. And through this kind of cascading shift in support, that's how the movement was able to dramatically grow and alter the political landscape. It's important to recognize that this was not an accidental thing. This was a very clear, calculated move to expand the movement's base of supporters, and it demonstrates the effectiveness of using a model like the spectrum of allies to drive social change. So how do we use the spectrum of allies? If you want to use this as a framework in your work, I recommend you grab a piece of paper and literally draw the half pie semicircle diagram, split it into 5 different pizza slices, and label them all. You've got the core of the movement on the left-hand side, the neutral people in the middle, and then the opposition on the right. Label each section and begin to brainstorm the categories of people that fall into each of those different categories. If you can, try to be as specific as possible when you're using this tool. So avoid generic categories. So don't just say like students, workers. List very precise subgroups. So you could say students in community colleges or gig economy workers in suburban areas. And the more specific your categories are, the more tailored and effective your outreach efforts can be. Then you want to identify any knowledge gaps. So recognize where more research is going to be needed to understand these different stakeholders and develop a plan for actually getting this information, including their motivations, their concerns, and any potential entry points into the movement. Obviously, this is something that you would want to do as part of your theory of change. So if you are running your own intervention and you're using the theory of change canvas, this activity helps you understand your stakeholders a little bit better. And any of those assumptions that you need to understand your supporter base a little bit better, they are your assumptions. You need to test them, you need to collect evidence for them, and then you need to adapt this accordingly. Then you need to develop a specific strategy to actually engage all of these different groups and help them to collect the points that they need to move through the spectrum. So for any of your active allies, you want to provide them kind of opportunities for deeper involvement. Maybe this is leadership roles or training, or maybe you want to engage your active allies in efforts to have these conversations for change so that they can also be working to bring more people in towards the ally side of your spectrum of allies. For any passive allies, you want to be recognizing any kind of low barriers that are preventing them from participating. So this could be anything from signing a petition to attending an event. Anything that's going to get them to actively engage with your cause is going to be really important. Recognize those kind of low barriers, use those as leverage points to engage these people more actively in your movement. For any people who are neutral, you're probably going to want to rely on things like storytelling here. So using storytelling, social media, mainstream media, and personal outreach to really increase their awareness and their empathy towards people that are affected by this issue. For people who are passively opposed, your conversations here are probably going to be more focused on engaging in dialogue and conversations where you're addressing a lot of the concerns that they have or any misconceptions that they have. They've probably developed a lot of opinions about your particular cause if they're passively opposed to it based on things that they've heard here and there. Probably things on social media that have framed the issue in maybe a negative light. And so here you want to be as empathetically as possible addressing those misconceptions. You don't just want to be telling them why they are outright wrong to think that and why you're trying to convince them to change. You want to be having conversations where you really explore these. We have another episode. It is episode 3 of this season. It's called How to Effectively Use Social Media, I think, for Meaningful Social Change, something like that. And in that episode, we go through 2 really useful frameworks for discussing kind of complex issues on social media, but you can use these frameworks in your conversations for change. So if somebody has an objection to something that you say or an objection to your cause or your movement, you can use the explore, equalize, and elevate framework. So the explore means you want to listen to the objection that they've said and you want to ask questions to identify what their real concern is. So if they say something, you want to be saying things back to them. What I hear you saying is that you are concerned with blah, 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 blah. Repeat it back to them and get them to say, yes, that is my concern. You don't want to twist what they're saying so that they feel like you're trying to manipulate them. You want to genuinely listen to what they're saying, identify what the key concern in what they are objecting to is, and then present that back to them so that they can say, yes, that's what my concern is. Then you want to equalize. You want to acknowledge the person's concerns or feelings and you want to empathize with them. You want to say, I understand why you would feel that way. I completely understand why you feel like that, given the current climate that we're living in. I myself have felt a lot of anxiety about blah, 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 whatever it might be. You want to equalize with them to show them that you genuinely understand where they're coming from. And then you want to elevate. So you want to continue to pose new questions to them that essentially allows them to review and perhaps change their position. You want to say, but once I understood that blah, 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 I actually began to realize blah, blah, blah. Is that something that you've thought of? Or how would it feel to you if blah, blah, blah? Like whatever it is, you want to present questions back to them and then you can move through that same cycle. So then they would maybe answer your question with another objection that they have. And then you go back to that explore stage and you're like, okay, so I understand that you're concerned with blah, blah, blah. And you go through that cycle. That's a really great way to have conversations for change where you're genuinely trying to understand what people's concerns are and you're not just trying to convince them that they are wrong. That's never going to work. Have you ever changed your opinion when somebody tried to convince you that you were wrong? Of course not. We have cognitive biases that literally mean our brain is designed to force us to double down when somebody challenges us. It seems illogical because our brains are not logical. If somebody presents you with an argument against what you believe, your brain naturally reverts to doubling down on what you do believe. So don't think for 1 minute that just telling somebody that they're wrong and trying to convince them why is enough. We need to be having these conversations. We need to be planting the seeds and hoping that when the person then goes and engages with other types of media or other people, we want to help them collect enough points. So that's a really great framework that we can use to engage in dialogue with people who are passively opposed to us. Now, the thing about people who are actively opposed to our cause, direct conversation having any meaningful impact is quite unlikely. Having direct conversation with active opponents is very unlikely to shift their opinion. If somebody is actively against something, it's very different to somebody who's like passively against something. And a lot of your efforts in terms of having conversations for change with people are probably not going to be as effective. Here, we need to be using broader strategies or tactics that are seeking to contribute to those broader cultural shifts within a society. We probably can't shift those people's positions simply through meaningful conversations for change. But you can try. If it's somebody that you have a personal relationship with, a family member, a friend, a co-worker, whatever it might be, then you might be able to plant some of those seeds. But for somebody to be actively against something, it's probably referring back to that iceberg model that I mentioned in the beginning. It's something that there is so deeply intertwined with their values that it would be very challenging for you to accrue enough points or plant enough seeds that person would actually change their perspective or change their opinion. The most important thing to remember here is that it takes multiple conversations. You don't just plant a single seed in the ground and expect a garden to flourish, right? You have to plant multiple seeds. Not all of them are going to take root. Not all of them are going to survive. So it's the same approach here. We don't know how many points every individual that we engage with needs to accrue before they begin to shift their perspective. And so it's going to take a passive opponent, probably a lot of exposure to different perspectives to become maybe neutral about the issue and to start to question some of their previous assumptions. For a neutral person, they're probably going to need to hear multiple voices and perspectives advocating for an issue before they move towards passive allyship. And a passive ally is probably going to be a little bit easier to move towards active allyship than it is going to be to move those other people. They might need to be given a few clear entry points before they become an active ally. Don't expect people to just jump from opposition to allyship straight away. The goal is to create the conditions that allows them to move naturally through this spectrum at their own pace, and recognizing that every conversation is opportunity to give them more points or to plant more seeds. Just some kind of like general tips in terms of having these conversations for change, particularly like the person who asked this question, particularly for the person who asked this question, if you're not using social media and you are just looking to have conversations for change with somebody, make sure you are asking those thought-provoking questions and don't just make these like big declarative statements. Don't try to position your perspective as like the truth. That's going to scare people away. That's going to make people retreat and think, oh, who is this person that is trying to preach to me and convince me that I'm wrong? You want to ask questions that are going to invite reflection, and you want to avoid statements that are going to make it feel like a confrontation rather than a meaningful conversation. Try to share personal stories or stories that you have permission to share. You can share stories of other people's lived experience, but make sure you're doing it in an ethical way. You obviously don't want to be sharing stories of people that haven't been shared publicly before, because that is their story to share. If somebody shares something with you in the work that you're doing in confidence, you don't want to go sharing that with random people that don't know this person. But it is important because we don't want to just rely on facts and figures. People are going to connect a lot more deeply to a story of lived experience rather than these kind of abstract numbers or statements or arguments. Try to offer resources to people for further self-exploration. So I mentioned that your kind of job when you're having a conversation for change is to plant those seeds, but it's the engagement with other sources and other media that really helps to water those seeds or fertilize those seeds. So recommend books, recommend documentaries, recommend a series on Netflix, whatever you have to do that's going to allow people to engage with these different ideas on their own terms. As like a personal example, I have a number of people in my life who I think had this perspective of domestic violence or abusive relationships where they couldn't really comprehend how somebody would choose to stay in a relationship like that. And there's a series on Netflix called Made, M-A-I-D. I love it. I've watched it like 4 times. And I think it's a great series. It's like a 10-part series, but it follows this girl who lives in, I want to say Missouri, if that's a place. I don't even know. But she has a daughter, and basically once she has this daughter, her whole life, her plans to go to college all kind of get put on hold. They can't afford to pay for childcare and stuff, so she's looking after the kid. She doesn't have a job. She doesn't have access to her own bank account and all of these things. And it shows you in an engaging format because it's a Netflix series, the realities and how hard it can be for people to leave these relationships. Without too many spoilers, she tries to leave, she goes back, and it shows the realities of what it can be like for people in these relationships. And that's just an example of how I've got a number of people in my life to just get a different perspective on what the realities of being in an abusive relationship can be like. If there are series that you enjoy on Netflix that kind of touch on these important social issues, use those as things to recommend to people, because you're probably more likely to convince somebody to go and watch a really highly rated Netflix series or series on a streaming service than you're going to convince them to go and watch a documentary. Watching a documentary sounds like homework. Watching a Netflix series sounds like a fun activity to do on an evening. Finally, you also need to recognize that people need time to sit with and process cognitive dissonance. Rather than expecting them to just resolve it immediately, sometimes the discomfort of contradicting views that we hold needs to be the driver of deeper reflection. Another kind of like personal example, I remember years ago when I first went vegan, I was having a conversation with my dad, and my dad was actively opposed to the concept of veganism. And I was not trying to convince him or anyone else in my family to go vegan, but we got into this heated debate, and I basically said to him, I'm not arguing that everyone in the world should be vegan, but his argument was like, animals are meant to be eaten. And then I presented this argument that no, I don't think that animals were meant to be eaten. I think that they can be eaten to sustain us, but it's very clear that I don't need to eat them, and humans don't need to eat them in a lot of situations to survive and thrive. And the conversation felt like it didn't really go anywhere for me. But a couple of days later, or the next time I went over and I saw him, he told me that he'd thought about it and he can see my perspective now. And he obviously needed a little bit of time to just sit with that and think, you know what, she's probably right. She's not withering away to nothing. Like, she doesn't need to eat animals, and there's a difference between needing to do something and being able to do something. And so he just needed time to sit with that cognitive dissonance and reflect a little bit. So recognize the importance of time and exposure. This is the watering of the seeds, or the fertilizing of the seeds in this analogy. Once you've planted those seeds, the person's journey across this spectrum of allies is going to be influenced largely by their environment. They're going to be having conversations with other people. They're going to be exposed to different media and other people who have different lived experience as well as their own lived experience. And you might not be able to change their perspective in the moment, but over time, when they encounter narratives that reinforce the seeds you've planted, this is going to be like watering those seeds. So it could be anything from news stories that kind of highlight an injustice that maybe they'd previously dismissed. It could be a personal experience that they have that suddenly makes an abstract concept feel a bit more real. It could be conversations with other people that maybe share the same perspective that you had that kind of presents it in a different way to the way you presented it. It could be moments of personal reflection when something kind of clicks in their head months or even years later. So a lot of social movements throughout history have been successful because they recognized that the long arc of change from being an active opponent to an active ally is one that requires a lot of time and exposure. And so the reality is that shifting any kind of societal attitudes requires patience. This was evident in the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, and even a lot of environmental activism. We see a lot of incremental shifts, and we just have to be patient and recognize that over time, as more individuals move across this spectrum of allies at their own pace, we will eventually see each one of these is going to contribute to larger transformation. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I could yap on forever about conversations for change and just communication for social change more generally. I obviously love the topic of communication for social change. That's why I did my PhD in communication for social change. And this is the kind of stuff that really got me interested in that field. Obviously, my research actually took a very different direction and it really had nothing to do with this kind of stuff. But I have been in the social impact space long enough, and I'm exposed to so much stuff, particularly online, where sometimes it can feel helpless, or it can feel like, what is the point? We're not getting anywhere. How can we convince people to care about something? How can people hold these views that something isn't important just because it doesn't affect them? And I just have to constantly remind myself that it is just like this game of planting seeds, giving people enough points here and there, and eventually transformation will happen. If you haven't listened to the recent episode that we did on Martin Luther King's nonviolent philosophy, check that one out. It's episode number 21 of this season. But one of the kind of core principles of Kingian nonviolence is that the universe, or God, is always on the side of justice. And that is something that I truly wholeheartedly believe with all my being. I think that the universe, or if you believe in God, God is always on the side of justice, and it might take time, but eventually we will get there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, if you have any questions, there's a link in the episode description to ask your questions, or if you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, you can just directly leave your questions in the episode that you're listening to as a comment, and I would be more than happy to answer them in an upcoming episode.